I can't believe I'm even writing this. I thought my life was one of those rare, steady ones where you don't need to question your partner's every move. Sarah and I have been married for over 20 years. I'd always felt I was one of the lucky ones, finding someone who'd stand by me through everything. But now, I feel like I don't know the woman I've spent more than half my life with. It all started with a phone call. She was out, and her phone, left charging on the kitchen counter, rang. It was late, and we never get calls that time of night, so I thought it might be something urgent. I picked it up, ready to explain that Sarah wasn't around. But as soon as I said hello, a male voice cut in. "Is Sarah still coming?" I froze. Something about the casual, confident tone in his voice made my skin prickle. "Excuse me?" I said. The guy on the other end seemed startled, muttered something like "wrong number," and hung up. But I couldn't shake that moment. Who was calling Sarah at this hour, expecting her to come over? And why did he sound so familiar? So sure she'd be there? When she got home, I brought it up, figuring there had to be a simple explanation. I expected her to laugh it off, to tell me it was just some work thing or an old friend. Instead, she got this strange look, something like annoyance, and was that guilt? She waved it off, saying it was probably a wrong number, that people make mistakes. But as she spoke, she wouldn't meet my eyes, kept looking past me, almost like she was rehearsing a line. That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation over and over. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that the years had made me paranoid. But it planted something inside me, a nagging doubt I couldn't ignore. And, as I would soon learn, that single moment was the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew. I told myself not to overthink it. 20 years of marriage deserved the benefit of the doubt, didn't it? I tried to push the whole thing to the back of my mind, chalking it up to some weird, innocent misunderstanding. But once you start questioning, it's hard to stop. That single phone call had cracked something open, and now I was noticing things I'd ignored before. Sarah started mentioning a friend she'd made recently. She didn't say much, just that he was someone she connected with on a different level, someone who understood her. I found myself trying to suppress a knee-jerk reaction every time she mentioned him. I mean, who was this guy, and why was he suddenly popping up in our conversations? The way she spoke about him was casual, sure, but it felt forced, like she was testing out how much she could share without raising alarm bells. Then came the changes to her routine. Sarah had never been one to go out alone much, but suddenly, she needed these long walks in the evenings to clear her mind. She talked about personal growth and finding herself, which on its own would be fine, except it felt like she was building a wall between us, brick by brick. I started watching, quietly observing her behavior. She'd come back from her walks, looking freshly made up, with a glow that wasn't from just exercise. And there was a new scent clinging to her, some expensive perfume I didn't recognize. She was dressing differently too, designer clothes that she'd never shown any interest in before. All of this felt foreign, like someone else was invading our lives, creeping into our home through Sarah. I tried to ask about it. Just small, harmless questions to test the waters, to see if she'd open up. But every time I brought it up, she'd snap, accusing me of being controlling, of not letting her have her own life. The more she lashed out, the more suspicious I became. This woman, the one sitting across the dinner table with cold eyes and defensive remarks, felt like a stranger. And that's when I realized she was hiding something. But I still wasn't prepared for just how deep that secret went. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The hints, the late nights, the defensiveness, it all pointed to something going on behind my back. I decided I needed proof, something concrete to put my mind at ease, or if my gut was right, to confirm my worst fears. Then came the opportunity I'd been waiting for. One evening, Sarah left her phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked. I knew it was a violation of her privacy, but at this point, I was desperate. I needed answers. I picked up her phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through her messages, feeling a strange mix of dread and guilt. It didn't take long to find them. The text with a man named Paul stood out right away, littered with little heart emojis, explicit messages, and secret plans. They spoke in a way we hadn't spoken to each other in years, flirty, intimate like teenagers in love. My heart dropped as I read line after line, detailing moments they'd shared that I had never even suspected. One message in particular hit me like a punch to the gut. "Can't wait to see you again. Can't stop thinking about last night." And then he'd added, "Let's make it a whole weekend next time." I could feel bile rising in my throat. They weren't just meeting up here and there. This was planned, deliberate. They were arranging whole weekends together, days where she'd told me she was visiting family or catching up with an old friend. But that wasn't even the worst of it. As I kept scrolling, I found messages where they talked about me, about how clueless I was, about how safe she felt knowing I'd never find out. The casual disdain she showed for me in those messages tore through me. She described me as boring, predictable, even pathetic, as if I were nothing more than a hurdle in her life. Here was the woman I'd spent 2 decades building a life with, tearing me apart in private like I was a stranger, a mere inconvenience. I had all the proof I needed, but the pain of discovering it, nothing could have prepared me for that. After reading those messages, I felt like I'd been gutted. I stood there, staring at her phone, trying to process everything I'd just seen. The explicit details, the confessions of love, the absolute lack of regard for me. It all hit harder than I'd imagined it would. I thought about confronting her right then and there, but something held me back. Maybe it was shock, or maybe I just needed a minute to gather myself, to let the anger and hurt settle before I faced her. The next few days were torture. I was holding this terrible secret, trying to act normal while feeling like my entire life was a lie. Every time she looked at me, I had to wonder if she was thinking about Paul, if she was counting the minutes until she could sneak off and be with him again. I felt trapped in my own home, suffocating on the lies that now filled every room, every corner. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just ignore this. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen those messages, or that the last 20 years hadn't just unraveled before my eyes. I needed more, though. I needed undeniable proof that she couldn't twist, couldn't deny, or explain away. I needed it all laid out in black and white, so that when I finally confronted her, there would be no escape. That's when I started going through her things, something I never thought I'd do in a million years. I checked her purse when she was in the shower, flipped through old receipts she'd stuffed into drawers, went through her emails. The more I found, the more it felt like a horror story unfolding in real time. In the bottom of her purse, hidden beneath her makeup bag, I found a hotel receipt for a weekend getaway. The date matched one of the weekends she'd told me she was visiting her sister. I felt my chest tighten as I stared at the paper, seeing her name and Paul scrawled in the guest information section. There were multiple charges on the bill: room service, champagne, a late checkout. It painted a clear picture of their time together, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I didn't stop there. I dug further, checking her email account for any travel bookings or receipts. She'd left her laptop open one evening, and I found more hotel reservations, dinner reservations at restaurants I'd never heard of, tickets for shows in nearby cities. She had a whole separate life she'd been living, a life that had no place for me in it. And then I found the final piece, the one that pushed me over the edge, a folder in her email labeled family. Inside were photos, documents, even a few letters from Paul. Among the photos, I found one of her holding a small child, a little boy I'd never seen before. I scrolled through more pictures of them together. Her and Paul, standing close with that same boy between them, his arms around both of them. My mind was racing, piecing things together faster than I could handle. My hands shook as I stared at the images, each one more damning than the last. That boy, he couldn't be more than 5 or 6 years old, which meant she'd conceived him while we were still married, while I'd been blissfully unaware of the life she was building with someone else. I couldn't even begin to process what that meant. How she'd hidden something so monumental, how she'd managed to keep a child out of our lives, our marriage, for so long. I closed the laptop and sat there numb. The reality was settling in, a suffocating weight on my chest. She hadn't just cheated on me. She'd built an entire life behind my back, an entire other family. I was nothing more than a side character in her world, a convenience she kept around to maintain appearances. For days, I kept this discovery to myself, unsure of how to proceed. Part of me wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers. But another part of me knew that confronting her would only lead to more lies, more denials. I needed a plan, something that would make her face the full extent of what she'd done. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this betrayal. Not after the years I'd poured into our marriage. Not after she'd made a fool of me. That's when the idea for my revenge began to form. I didn't want to just catch her in the act. I wanted everyone else to see her for who she really was. I wanted her friends, her family, everyone who thought she was this perfect, loving wife, to know the truth. She'd built this fake image of herself, this lie that she'd woven around me and everyone else in her life, and I was going to tear it down. The plan took shape over the next few days. I started organizing a dinner, something we hadn't done in a long time. I invited close friends, her family, a few of our neighbors, people who knew us well and who thought they understood what kind of person Sarah was. I kept the guest list small, intimate, just enough people to make an impact. On the night of the dinner, I acted like everything was normal, smiling and chatting with our guests, all while Sarah put on her usual act. She laughed, joked, played the perfect hostess. Watching her act like nothing was wrong made my blood boil, but I kept calm, waiting for the perfect moment. After dinner, I stood up to give a small toast, saying a few words about the importance of trust, honesty, and loyalty in a marriage. I could see Sarah squirming, a slight frown appearing as she realized something was off. Then, without missing a beat, I pulled out my phone and began reading one of the messages between her and Paul. Explicit, undeniable evidence of her affair, right there for everyone to hear. The room fell silent. Our friends, her family, everyone stared in shock as the words echoed in the quiet room. I could see her face turning pale, her eyes widening as the full weight of what was happening sank in. She tried to grab my phone, tried to stop me, but I stepped back, letting everyone take in the reality of who she truly was. I ended the reading, leaving her phone on the table with other messages and photos open for everyone to see. She was exposed, her perfect image shattered in front of everyone she cared about. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of control, a sense of justice for the pain she'd caused me. After that dinner, I couldn't look at Sarah the same way. For the first time, I saw her for who she truly was. Not the woman I thought I'd married, but a stranger who'd crafted a life of lies right under my nose. The shocked faces of our friends and family, as I read her messages, still echoed in my mind, and the mixture of pity, horror, and judgment in their eyes was something she'd never be able to erase. Her carefully built reputation was gone in an instant, shattered beyond repair. In the days that followed, Sarah tried desperately to save face. She became relentless, constantly calling and texting me, pleading for a chance to talk. At first, I ignored her. The wounds were still fresh, and I had no interest in hearing more excuses or apologies. But she didn't let up. She showed up at places she knew I frequented, our local coffee shop, my favorite park, even the community book readings I loved. Each time, she'd sit quietly nearby, hoping for eye contact, for some form of acknowledgement. It was pathetic, honestly, watching her try to pretend nothing was wrong while everyone around her knew the truth. Then came the letters, handwritten, full of emotional pleas, each one more desperate than the last. She wrote about our shared memories, reminiscing about trips we'd taken, special moments from our early years together, and how she missed the man I used to be. She claimed she'd lost herself, that she'd made a mistake and was willing to do anything to fix it. I could almost feel the desperation dripping off the pages, but all I saw was a calculated attempt to manipulate me back into her life. One of her letters went so far as to suggest couples counseling. She even attached a business card for a therapist she'd already contacted, claiming she was ready to work through everything if I'd give her the chance. I could almost laugh at the audacity of it. She wanted to talk about working through things as if her betrayal was just some minor marital hiccup. And then there were the attempts to win over my friends, the ones who'd been by my side after everything had come out. Sarah started reaching out to them individually, apologizing, trying to explain herself. She claimed she'd been going through something and lost her way, spinning a story about how our marriage had fallen into a rut and how Paul had been a mistake, a moment of weakness she regretted deeply. But it was too late for damage control. No one was buying her excuses. and I could see the bridges she'd burned were beyond repair. But Sarah's desperation didn't stop there. She tried to find ways to run into me, to spark up a conversation. Once, she even joined my book club, knowing full well it was my refuge, a place where I could escape the stress of daily life. She showed up uninvited, looking disheveled and apologetic, trying to blend in with the group while pretending everything was normal. The club members, who'd known me for years, looked at her with barely concealed disdain, and some even left early that night, refusing to be part of her spectacle. Eventually, I had to make my stance clear. I sent her a message, blunt and to the point. I didn't want to reconcile, I didn't want her in my life, and I certainly didn't want her showing up at my clubs or events. The divorce was inevitable, and any attempt to salvage things was a waste of time. I thought she'd get the hint after that, but of course I was wrong. Sarah responded with an even grander display. She started planning an apology trip, an all-expenses-paid vacation to a place we'd visited in our early years of marriage, a place that had once meant something to us. She sent me the itinerary, complete with a list of romantic excursions and luxurious dinners, hoping I'd be swept up in the nostalgia of it all. It was as if she thought a fancy trip would erase the years of lies and the broken trust. I didn't even dignify it with a response. In the meantime, I began working with a lawyer determined to finalize the divorce on my terms. I wanted her out of my life completely, and that included all the assets we'd built together. Sarah had always loved our vacation home, a peaceful retreat up north, nestled by the lake. It was her sanctuary, a place she'd go to escape and unwind. But now, it was nothing more than another piece of property that I'd take from her as part of the divorce settlement. The lawyer worked meticulously, ensuring that every loophole was closed, every angle covered. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, to lose the things she held dear as a consequence of her actions. There would be no mercy, no leniency. This wasn't a simple parting of ways. This was justice for 20 years of dedication and loyalty thrown away for a cheap affair. When she received the divorce papers, her reaction was predictable. She called me, leaving tearful voicemails, begging me to reconsider. She swore she'd never been with Paul for his money or his status, that she'd only been seeking an emotional connection she thought was missing in our marriage. But I wasn't falling for it. I'd seen the messages, the photos, the hotel receipts. This wasn't a cry for emotional connection. It was cold, calculated betrayal. In one last-ditch effort, she tried to pull in her family. Her parents, who'd once respected and welcomed me, called me up, asking to meet. They wanted to talk things over, to see if there was a way to keep the family intact. I agreed, not because I had any intention of backing down, but because I wanted them to hear the truth from me, unfiltered and raw. When we met, I laid everything out for them, the messages, the photos, the hidden child she'd kept secret for years. They sat there, stunned, as the weight of Sarah's deception sank in. Her mother, a proud woman who'd once sung Sarah's praises, looked down in shame, her face flushed with embarrassment. Her father muttered something about losing respect for her, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. They believed Sarah was the perfect daughter, the loyal wife. But now they were seeing her for who she truly was. I left that meeting feeling a strange sense of relief. Sarah's last ally, her family, had turned their backs on her not out of hatred, but out of sheer disappointment. They didn't even try to convince me to forgive her. They understood that some betrayals went beyond forgiveness, beyond reconciliation. Sarah's actions had severed her ties, not just to me, but to everyone she once held dear. As the weeks dragged on, I felt lighter. I focused on my writing, on reconnecting with friends, and on rebuilding my life without the shadow of her betrayal hanging over me. The divorce was finalized with no chance of appeal, and she lost the vacation home she'd cherished so much. In the end, she was left with the remnants of a life she'd taken for granted, a life that was now empty of the people she'd once held close. But for me, it was a new beginning. The trust was gone, the innocence shattered, but I'd come out on the other side stronger, knowing I'd held true to my principles. I'd found a sense of peace in the wreckage, a way to move forward without bitterness, without resentment. And though the scars would remain, they served as a reminder of what I'd survived, of the strength I'd found within myself. Once the divorce was finalized, I thought the worst was behind me. I imagined that Sarah, left with her ruined reputation and the whispers of betrayal following her, would fade into the background, leaving me in peace. But I had underestimated her. Instead of retreating gracefully, Sarah decided to make my life difficult in every way she could. At first, it was small things, little acts of sabotage that were more annoying than harmful. She'd leave passive-aggressive messages on social media, cryptic posts that were clearly about me, hinting that I'd wronged her, portraying herself as a victim of years of neglect and emotional distance. Friends would screenshot her posts and send them to me, asking if I was okay, if there was something more to the story. It was infuriating to see her twisting the truth, painting herself as the innocent one. Then, she started contacting mutual friends, trying to sway them to her side. She'd call them up, putting on this pitiful act, talking about how she'd lost everything and how I'd been unforgiving and cold. Some friends, who didn't know the full story or couldn't believe the extent of her deception, actually started to sympathize with her. They'd reach out to me, cautiously suggesting I reconsider things or move on from the anger. It was maddening to see people falling for her lies, and it took every ounce of patience not to explode in frustration. One night, I got a call from one of my closest friends, Jake. He'd known Sarah almost as long as he'd known me, and he wanted answers. "Mike, she's saying you just abandoned her, that you never gave her a chance to explain," he said, his voice laced with doubt. "What's really going on here?" So, I laid it all out for him. The affair, the lies, the hidden child. I told him about the dinner, about her shameless attempts at reconciliation, about her continuing manipulation even after everything had been exposed. By the end, Jake was silent, absorbing the weight of what I told him. "I had no idea," he finally said, sounding shaken. "I feel like an idiot for even entertaining her sob story." That conversation with Jake marked a turning point. Slowly, people started seeing Sarah for who she truly was. Word spread among our circle, and as the truth came out, more friends reached out to apologize, to show their support. Sarah's narrative, her carefully crafted version of events, was falling apart piece by piece, leaving her isolated. She tried to cling to the few friendships she had left, but people were pulling away, not wanting to get dragged into the mess she created. Around this time, I decided to make one last move to ensure that she faced the consequences of her actions professionally, too. Sarah worked in a respected position in a company where reputation mattered, where personal integrity was everything. Knowing this, I compiled the evidence I'd found. The messages, the photos, the hotel receipts, even snippets of her more unsavory texts disparaging her own company. I packaged it all together, anonymous and carefully worded, and sent it to her boss. I didn't expect them to fire her outright, but I knew they'd take note, that it would shake her standing in a company that valued professionalism. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach her. She tried to downplay it, claiming the allegations were false, an attempt by a bitter ex to smear her name. But with the evidence so damning, her colleagues began to distance themselves, and her reputation took a serious hit. Her hours were cut. She was left out of important projects, and eventually, she was forced to resign under the weight of the scandal. She'd lost her position, her friendships, and any remaining respect she might have had in the industry. It was poetic justice, watching her career crumble as a result of her own choices. But even then, Sarah didn't let go. She started sending me letters again, this time filled with venom instead of remorse. She blamed me for everything, accusing me of ruining her life and of taking everything from her. She seemed unable to accept responsibility for her actions, unable to see that every consequence she faced was a direct result of her own lies and betrayals. She painted me as the villain, as if I'd forced her into her actions, as if my response was the real betrayal. At first, I kept the letters, unsure of what to do with them. But eventually, I stopped reading them, discarding each one as soon as it arrived. Her words no longer had power over me. I had moved on, found peace in the closure of knowing I'd held her accountable. The anger that had once driven me was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve, a focus on rebuilding my life. In the following months, I found myself re-engaging with things I'd set aside during our marriage. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to visit, but never had the chance to. I started writing again, diving into projects I'd only dreamed of before. I reconnected with old friends, some who'd drifted away over the years, but were more than willing to rekindle our friendships. My life felt lighter, unburdened by the constant tension and deception that had once weighed it down. One day, while sorting through some old belongings, I found a photo of Sarah and me from our early days together. We were laughing, carefree, lost in our own world. Looking at it, I didn't feel sadness or regret. I felt a strange sort of gratitude. That version of Sarah, the one I'd loved, was gone, replaced by a stranger I couldn't recognize. But the experience had shown me my own strength, had forced me to look inward, to rebuild from the ground up. I had come out stronger, clearer about who I was and what I wanted. And now, looking back, I realized I wouldn't change a thing. I'd faced betrayal, endured humiliation, and felt the sting of betrayal. But I'd survived it all, and in doing so, I'd reclaimed my life, my dignity. I'd come to terms with the end of that chapter, ready to write the next one on my own terms, unburdened by the past. For anyone who's reading this, who's been through something similar, my advice is simple. Don't settle for someone who treats you like an afterthought. Don't let betrayal define you. Stand up, fight for your dignity, and remember that healing is a process, but one you control. You owe it to yourself to find peace, to reclaim your life. And if you find the strength to walk away, to hold firm against manipulation, you'll come out on the other side stronger than ever. After months of dealing with Sarah's fallout and rebuilding my life, I started feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. With every step forward, it became clearer that I'd been living in a haze for too long, caught up in a marriage that had slowly eroded who I was. I'd spent so much time trying to make Sarah happy, trying to be the kind of husband I thought she wanted, that I'd lost sight of myself. But now, without her influence, I felt like I was finally reconnecting with who I was meant to be. During this time, something unexpected happened. I met someone new. Her name was Lisa, a friend of a friend who I'd been introduced to at a community event. We started off just chatting here and there, grabbing coffee after the occasional book club meeting or running into each other at local events. Lisa was everything Sarah wasn't. Honest, grounded, genuinely kind. There was a warmth about her that felt like a balm to my soul. And before long, we were spending more time together. At first, I was hesitant to open up about everything that had happened with Sarah. I didn't want to burden Lisa with my past or have it overshadow the connection we were building. But one night, over dinner, the conversation naturally drifted into relationships, and I found myself telling her everything. To my surprise, Lisa didn't pity me or try to fix me. She listened, nodding thoughtfully, and shared her own stories of past hurts and betrayals. It was a raw, honest conversation, the kind I hadn't had in years, and it felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders. Our relationship grew slowly, carefully, and I found myself enjoying each moment without the rush or pressure I'd felt in the past. Lisa respected my need for time and space to heal, and she never pushed for more than I was ready to give. It was a refreshing change, a reminder that love could be gentle, that it didn't have to be wrapped in deceit or manipulation. With her, I felt safe, seen, understood in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. But just as I was beginning to move forward, Sarah made one last attempt to drag me back into her world. One evening, as I was getting ready to meet Lisa for dinner, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, looking disheveled and broken. She was clearly not the composed woman she'd once been. Her hair was messy, her clothes rumpled, and there was a desperation in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Michael, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I could feel a flicker of sympathy. After all, we had spent 20 years together. But I knew better than to let her in, both literally and metaphorically. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, and asked her to keep it brief. Sarah went on to tell me how sorry she was, how she missed me, how her life had fallen apart since I'd left. She tried to shift the blame, claiming that her affair with Paul was a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by feeling neglected and unappreciated. She even tried to bring up the vacations we used to take, talking about how much she missed those days and wished we could go back. It was as if she thought she could gloss over everything with nostalgia, that she could somehow rewrite history with a few well-placed words. But I wasn't buying it. I told her that she'd made her choices, and that those choices had consequences. I reminded her of the lies, the betrayal, the hidden child she'd kept secret for years. As I spoke, I could see her face crumble, her facade cracking as she realized there was no way back. The woman who'd once been so sure of herself, so confident in her ability to manipulate, now looked small, lost, desperate. "I never meant to hurt you, Michael," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. But I didn't feel anything, not anger, not sadness, not even pity. I felt nothing. She was just another person to me now, someone I used to know, someone who no longer held any power over me. I told her goodbye, making it clear that I didn't want to see or hear from her again. I walked back inside, leaving her standing there, and as I closed the door, I felt a final sense of closure. It was over. Truly, finally over. In the months that followed, my relationship with Lisa deepened. She became a steady presence in my life, a reminder that love could be built on trust, on kindness, on mutual respect. We traveled together, laughed together, shared the little moments that had once felt so empty in my marriage to Sarah. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy, free from the shadows of betrayal and regret. Looking back, I realized that everything I'd gone through with Sarah had led me to this moment. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, it had all been a necessary part of my journey, a catalyst for change. I'd learned to set boundaries, to stand up for myself, to demand the respect I deserved. I'd learned that forgiveness was possible, but only for those who showed true remorse, true accountability, something Sarah had never done. And as for Sarah, last I heard, she was still struggling, caught in a cycle of failed relationships and half-hearted attempts to rebuild her life. She tried to move away, tried to start over in a new town, but the shadow of her choices followed her wherever she went. Friends told me she'd been in and out of jobs, that her reputation had never fully recovered. It was a strange kind of justice, watching her unravel under the weight of her own lies. But that was her path, her burden to bear. I was done with her story, done with the pain and the drama. I'd moved on, built a life filled with genuine connection, true friendship, and love that was real. And while the scars of the past would always be there, they were no longer a source of pain. They were a reminder of how far I'd come. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone reading this, it's that you don't have to stay trapped in a relationship that drains you, that leaves you feeling empty and alone. You deserve someone who values you, who stands by you, who respects the life you're building together. And if you find yourself betrayed, hurt, left in the ruins of a life you thought was real, remember that healing is possible, that love is out there waiting, if you're willing to let go of what no longer serves you. As for me, I finally found peace, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The peace I felt after closing the door on Sarah that last time was nothing short of life-changing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by suspicion or resentment. I could finally breathe. In the months after the divorce was finalized, I made a promise to myself to rebuild my life, no matter how daunting it felt. With each passing day, I began to reclaim parts of myself that I'd lost over the years. My writing, for instance, came flooding back to me. It had always been my way of processing emotions, of making sense of the world, but during my marriage to Sarah, it had been something she constantly dismissed. "It's just a hobby, Michael," she'd say whenever I brought it up. But for me, it was much more than that. It was my passion, my purpose. Without Sarah's negativity lingering over my shoulder, I found myself pouring hours into writing, sometimes losing myself completely in the pages, rediscovering the joy and satisfaction I hadn't felt in ages. With a revived sense of purpose, I committed to writing my novel, a story that had been simmering in the back of my mind for years, but never had the chance to grow. Lisa, who'd been steadily becoming a major part of my life, became my biggest support. She'd read drafts, give feedback, and encourage me even on days when self-doubt crept in. Her encouragement felt genuine, like she truly believed in me and my work. I wasn't used to that. In my marriage, it had always felt like my ambitions were obstacles, distractions from real life. But with Lisa, I didn't have to choose. I could be myself, dreams and all. Lisa and I began spending more time together, and it was refreshing to have someone who respected my passions and encouraged my independence. I never felt pressured or judged. She saw me for who I was, flaws included, and valued me for them. It was a foreign feeling after all those years with Sarah, but one that filled me with hope. I hadn't realized how starved I'd been for real connection, for a partner who believed in me without hidden motives or criticisms. With Lisa, everything felt right. There was no drama, no deceit, just honesty and mutual respect. Meanwhile, though, Sarah was still trying to make her way back into my life in whatever way she could. The text messages dwindled eventually, but every so often, I'd hear about her through mutual friends or acquaintances. And from what I gathered, her life was far from the fairy tale she'd tried to craft for herself. Her affair with Paul, which she'd thrown away our marriage for, had fizzled out fast. Apparently, Paul hadn't stuck around once things became complicated, and he was out of her life shortly after the divorce was final. Her attempts to move on had fallen apart just as quickly. Friends told me she'd gone on a string of dates, tried to jump into relationships that never lasted more than a few months. Each time, it would end with the same story. She'd start strong, charming, and enthusiastic, but her temper, jealousy, and manipulative tendencies would come out sooner or later, driving people away. She had always been a master at first impressions, fooling people with her wit and charm, but once they saw her true nature, it didn't take long for them to leave. The way she tried to rewrite our history was almost laughable. Sarah had gone to great lengths to paint me as the bad guy in her post-divorce sob stories. She'd tell anyone who would listen that I had neglected her, that she had felt unfulfilled and trapped in our marriage. Some people believed her at first, people who hadn't known me well or who hadn't seen the cracks beneath her surface. But as more of the truth came out, the lies, the hidden child, the years of deceit, people began to distance themselves from her. For the first time, Sarah was alone in a way she'd never experienced. The respect she'd once held in our community had all but vanished, and even her closest friends were beginning to see her for who she was. The deception, the manipulation, it all added up, and she was no longer able to keep up the facade she'd hidden behind for so long. Sarah's spiral continued as people began to distance themselves from her. It wasn't just her friends, it was her family too. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that even her parents, who'd once praised her and saw her as their perfect daughter, had stepped back. They couldn't condone what she'd done, especially the deceit about the hidden child. Her parents had been shocked to the core when they learned of it, and from what I gathered, their relationship with her was strained, almost non-existent now. Sarah moved to another city, hoping to escape the whispers, but no matter where she went, her past followed her. She'd lost her job, her friends, her family's respect, all of it unraveling as a consequence of her own actions. A few former friends tried to stay in touch with her out of pity, but even they found it difficult to deal with her bitterness. She'd become consumed by resentment, angry at everyone around her, as if the world was to blame for her choices. She'd reach out to people only to blame them for not understanding her, pushing them further away each time. The last I'd heard, Sarah was moving from job to job, trying to find something stable, but no one wanted to keep her on for long. Her once vibrant social life was reduced to nearly nothing, and her attempts at dating had fizzled into a series of short, empty relationships. The life she had envisioned with Paul and the excitement she'd crave had left her isolated, forced to face the reality of her choices with no one left to blame but herself. It was a strange form of justice, one I hadn't expected but that felt fitting. Sarah had always managed to slip out of responsibility, to charm her way through life without ever facing the true consequences of her actions. But now, for the first time, there was no escape. She was finally living the life she'd built for herself, a life that bore the weight of her own lies, her own betrayal. But by then, her story no longer mattered to me. I'd come to realize that her downfall, while satisfying on some level, wasn't my true victory. My victory was the life I'd built after her, a life free from deception, filled with genuine relationships and meaningful pursuits. I'd found a peace that couldn't be taken away, a resilience that grew with each passing day. With Sarah's chapter behind me, I found myself embracing a new beginning. My life became about more than just moving on from the past. It became about creating something worthwhile, something I could be proud of. My novel, the one I'd poured myself into during those early days after the divorce, was finally finished. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, a testament to the journey I'd taken. And I felt a deep sense of pride as I typed the last word. Lisa and I continued to grow closer, building something that felt strong, real, and unwavering. With her, I felt safe, respected, truly valued in a way I hadn't been for years. We took things slowly, each respecting the other's past, each committed to creating a future rooted in honesty. With her by my side, I could finally see the kind of life I wanted, one built on mutual respect, not control, on kindness, not manipulation. I reconnected with friends, people who had seen me through my darkest days and who stood by me as I rebuilt. Some friendships had faded over the years, casualties of my marriage to Sarah, but now I found myself welcomed back with open arms. It was a reminder of the strength of genuine relationships, of the importance of people who cared not for appearances but for the real, unfiltered me. Reflecting on the journey, I came to realize that my happiness didn't hinge on Sarah's downfall, nor on the revenge I'd initially sought. It lay in the life I'd created after her, in the freedom and peace I'd found. I'd come out of the experience stronger, clearer about who I was and what I deserved. Sarah had once been my whole world, but now she was simply a lesson, a chapter that taught me to value honesty, integrity, and self-respect above all else. For anyone who's endured a betrayal like mine, my advice is simple. Don't stay where you're not valued. Don't let someone else's lies define your worth. Seek peace, build a life that reflects your values, and remember that healing isn't about revenge or resentment. It's about moving forward with dignity. I've learned that real strength lies in resilience, in the ability to rebuild after everything falls apart. And while scars remain, they're not marks of failure. They're reminders of survival, of the journey that shaped me into who I am today. In the end, my life wasn't broken by Sarah's betrayal. It was transformed, reshaped into something stronger, something real. And now, with a future wide open and a peace I once thought I'd lost, I know that I'm exactly where I need to be.